I'm Teisha Bader, and in the news, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the United States for the United Nations General Assembly held in New York City, his address to the UNGA, and his meetings on the sidelines of the gathering with world leaders, including with US President Joe Biden. Well, to discuss these events and their significance is former Israeli ambassador to the US, Danny Ayalon, speaking to us from Israel. Danny, it is always a pleasure and an honor to have you join us here on JBS. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Teisha. It's my pleasure.
So let's start with the Netanyahu-Biden meeting. That is sort of the dramatic event that people were waiting for. Prime Minister Netanyahu was certainly waiting for this meeting for a very long time. Let's talk first about how it happened and how long it took for it to happen. This was not a meeting at the White House, as Netanyahu perhaps would have preferred, but it was on the sidelines of the UN, as I said, in a hotel in New York City near UN headquarters. What is your general take on how this meeting took place?
Well, I think at the end of the day, it's a good thing and we should be forward-looking. It's not a secret that there was quite a lot of bad blood between the two leaders, and it took 9 months, actually, for the meeting to take place. It's very unusual. Usually when a prime minister is re-elected here, or a president, for that matter, in the United States, the two leaders meet within 2 to 3 months from their taking office. It's very important for the two countries. Of course, much more for Israel. We are the, let's say, the junior partner here, but it's a very important partnership. It's a natural partnership, and it serves both countries very well from a strategic point of view, security, intelligence. And I would say it's very important for the United States that to keep stability in the region, and for that matter, Israel is the most dependable ally for that. Unfortunately, this past 9 months, there was a lot of, let's say, acrimony almost between the two leaders, not the countries, the leaders, because of the judicial reform, which the United States and the administration sees it as actually a deviation from what Israel has always been proud of. It's liberal, Western style, pluralistic democracy, and because of radical elements in the government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, two ministers who have been poking the United States in their eyes all the time and making statements which were quite outrageous, I might say. And Netanyahu was not calling them into order, to the extent that in Washington they were saying, well, is the prime minister leading or is being led by his junior partners in the coalition? If he's not leading, then there is no point of talking to him. He should, have an order in his own house. In that respect, for the last 9 months, there was, and I think it's for the first time that I can recall, that Washington made a real distinction between the state of Israel and the government of Israel. When they had pretty much almost a boycott on the government, the relationship between the two, systems, most notably the defense establishment, was going very well and even getting closer. More intelligence sharing, more joint exercises, Air Force to Air Force, and many other things. And that was not the most healthy thing, because although, we were keeping, let's say, a good handle over the situation, but the fact that there is a daylight, or more than a daylight, between the two leaders of the United States and Israel, it may be misconstrued by enemies of Israel as a signal or an opportunity to attack and deteriorate the situation. So it wasn't good. But this has been in the past. Now that they have met, although it wasn't in Washington, it was in New York, now it's, I would say, almost water under the bridge. Now we should really look ahead. And indeed, the meeting dealt with the most important issues. First of all, Iran, which has to be kept at bay, and this is not conclusive yet. We will have to wait and see. Maybe we can speak about it a little bit later. And then there was the Saudi Arabian deal, which could change the entire Middle East, indeed the entire, I would say, global scene, because peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is the leader of the Arab world and the Muslim world, could really change things dramatically to the better. It could really be the best answer to Iran, to China, because also part of the deal would be creating a corridor between Asia and Europe through Saudi Arabia and through Israel. And that could be a huge geopolitical coup for the United States, for Israel, and also for Saudi Arabia. So all these issues were dealt with. Of course, the Palestinian issue, because Israel will have to give something to the Palestinians at the demand, not only of quite, I would say, maybe counterintuitively, it's not just a demand from the Saudis to give some gestures to the Palestinians, but also from the Democratic Party. The progressive elements in the Democratic Party would not sign or subscribe to this if there were not some conditions were met vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So there are a lot of issues to be dealt with, but it's very important they met, and now they can strategize together.
And it seems like the Saudi issue was sort of the bridge that they needed, perhaps. I don't know if you agree with me, to have this sit down go as well as it did. It seemed like, well, there's this larger issue at stake here, and we really need to come together because, as you said, this could be a groundbreaking agreement if it in fact goes through.
Sure, and on top of the interests, political, geopolitical, strategic, economic, security interests, which are so important for the three countries. It's a huge benefit for the United States, for Israel, and for Saudi Arabia. But also from a pure political point of view, this is really a real interesting intersection of national security and politics at the same time, because this is very important for the leaders themselves politically at home. For President Biden, he needs to show some major achievement, certainly before the upcoming elections. So that could establish him as a leader with great, let's say, achievements. Also, of course, stopping and countering the Chinese expansion. It's very important for Netanyahu to change the agenda and the public discourse in Israel altogether from the internal debates and the crisis to something which is maybe uplifting even and forward-looking. And also it's important for the Saudis, basically the MBS needs it to counter once and for all Iran, although that they have exchanged embassies still. The mortal enemy of Saudi Arabia is Iran, so it's very important for them. So with this merger, I would say, of political interests and geopolitical interests of the countries, this may be closer than ever before. And now we just have to wait and see.
And Danny, I'm curious what you think as far as the Palestinian issue. What might be the demand, or what might Israel be willing to agree to in such an agreement vis-a-vis the Palestinians? What are your thoughts of what that might look like?
Well, what Israel might agree to is not necessarily what is in its interests.
Uh-huh.
And here, I hope that Netanyahu, and I wrote about it, spoke about it a lot publicly, I hope here that Netanyahu will be strong enough to actually put aside narrow political interests of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and prefer over them the wider national interest of Israel. Right now, from what they say, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they do not agree to anything. And of course, this is a non-starter. Both the United States and the Saudis expect is first, freeze of settlement. Secondly, they would like to see a transfer of territory, territory C, full control of Israel, to cede some of it to the Palestinians. More than that, they would like to open or reopen the American consulate in Jerusalem, consulate for the Palestinians, to reopen the PLO office in Washington, D.C. On top of this, a lot of economic aid to the Palestinians and a commitment from Israel for a two-state solutions. This is quite a tall order, Teisha, and irrespective of what the radicals in the government, the extremists, whether it's Ben-Gvir or Smotrich say, this is something that we will have to look into from Israeli interests. And I'm not sure all these issues can be met quite as they have been put forward. So this is one thing vis-a-vis the Palestinians. There's another issue, which is the nuclear issue.
Which is what? I'm sorry, Danny?
The nuclear issue, which is the Saudi demand for having a full independent enrichment fuel cycle in Saudi Arabia. And this is something that I don't think Israel should and can agree to.
Interesting. So there's a lot, as you said, perhaps a tall order in several areas that will have to be looked at and ultimately might make it a little more difficult, but hopefully an agreement can be reached. Let's get to the judicial reforms a bit, as you touched upon. We've seen in recent days, and we just concluded Yom Kippur, where, we all take time to reflect and to look at the past year and what we can do better and how we can sort of extend a hand to those perhaps who we don't agree with. And it seems like the deep, deep discord is just continuing and becomes more and more painful as we go forward. We saw in Tel Aviv on the eve of Yom Kippur, a prayer service that was organized, and there was a dispute as to whether there should be a gender barrier, a mechitza there by a religious group that organized the prayer. And Tel Aviv, the Supreme Court ruled that there can be no barrier, and there were confrontations between secular Jews and religious Jews. And it was really so painful to see from here. And I'm sure from within Israel, it's even more difficult to see those images and to hear about what happened and Israel's leaders calling for unity. What is your take on the current situation? You've seen a lot of things over the years, Danny, as a diplomat, as an Israeli, as an ambassador. What do you make of where Israeli society is right now and what hope there is, hopefully in the near future?
Well, Teisha, this, first of all, I totally agree with you. It was very painful to watch for Israelis, Jews all over, whether it's in Israel or abroad. And it's also a manifestation of the depth of the crisis in Israel. And here I must say it's a crisis which was not called for and should not have happened. And it's a crisis that was started by people in the government, like Justice Minister Yariv Levin, like some of the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi, and some of the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir people, and which actually took over the government. And again, I refer back to what we discussed in the beginning. This is where, again, Netanyahu was not in the picture. This is not the prime minister I remember, that I have known to and I worked for many years back. It's a Netanyahu that is not in control. And what happened here with this, it's not the judicial reform anymore. It's much more than that. It's a Pandora box which has been opened, and it goes and it rubs Israeli the wrong way on so many seam lines. The Haredi secular line, the right and left line, the settlers and the non-settlers, even to the Sephardi and Ashkenazi. Everything is kind of in almost a perfect form, is floating and just in a almost like a jet of all these nefarious things. I'm optimistic, and what I hope is that we will see a cleansing of all these things that may have been suppressed. But one thing is certain, is that this reform cannot go on as it started. What I can see also is that the government has to go the extra mile, because the government is in control. This is leadership. I don't agree with everything that the opposition does, but it is for the government to extend its hand. And Netanyahu said, and he tells it that he was extending his hand, but his hand was not met by the opposition. Not true. Not true. I can tell it from here. If we could go back to the 4th of January of this year, when Mr. Levin, the Justice Minister, started his reform, if we could go back to that moment and rethink together, it's not that we don't need reforms, but let's do it together. And also, there is something here which we all must understand. Yes, this government, this coalition won fairly and squarely the elections. It's a legitimate government. However, elections with occasional majority in the Knesset does not give the coalition and the government the right to change the rules of the game. Elections is about who is going to manage the game, but not to change the rules of the game. To change the rules of the game, you must have consensus. And at this point, unfortunately, and we saw it over Yom Kippur, everything has become political, even the most sacred day in Judaism. Everything is political, and we have to depoliticize things. And to do that, the first step, as I see it, comes from the government.
And it's interesting, Danny, getting back to President Biden's sit down with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the judicial reform was touched upon. And while it may not be written in any sort of, as part of any sort of agreement with the Saudis, do you think, though, there might be some unwritten understanding between Biden and Netanyahu that this crisis has to be resolved before such an agreement can be reached? Is there something to that?
Well, there was no reference, and there wouldn't be any reference. And I'm sure in the one-on-one, this thing was discussed. But I can tell you although on the face of it, these are two not related issues. I mean, the judicial reform is an internal Israeli issue.
Yeah.
And one would say, and I agree, that it's up to the Israelis to solve it, and we don't need any aid from the outside. The United States is our best friend and ally, but we should deal with it ourselves. However, I can tell you that the United States is not like any other country when it comes to Israel, and trying to be objective. What the Americans say, and I hear a lot of the talk and conversation in Washington, D.C., is that they do not meddle in Israeli domestic affairs. They do not tell Israelis what reform, how much, when to do a reform. This is not the case. What do they say? What is the message? The consistent message from the United States, from Biden all the way down, is just reach a consensus. when you do such major change, reach a consensus. And why do we have the right to tell you that to reach a consensus? Not only because Israel's security is dear to us, it's also an important interest of the United States that Israel will continue to be the strongest nation in the region. The United States has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in that. It's also an American interest, but they do not want this just to go thrown into the sideline, because if Israel is not united, and united is not necessarily not having a political discourse. It's fine. Unity is not uniformity. We will never be uniform, but united, that means in the very same elements of, ascribing to the same narrative, to the same values, to the same Jewish, future, based on our Jewish past and legacy. What do they say? If you're not united, then you are seen, as we also discussed it, you are seen less strong, weaker, which can tempt all those nefarious elements in the region to attack you. And we already see the gloating in Iran, the gloating in Gaza, in Lebanon with the Hezbollah, when they are just, laughing at Israel. They couldn't believe. They say they're doing the work for us. And this is where the United States' concern is, because they say we need a strong Israel which can reflect the deterrence over any of the enemies of the United States and Israel, being Iran, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and all that. And for that, it is very important for us to tell you, reach a consensus. And I think this is a fair, let's say, expectation from the United States. And I say it now as an Israeli. We need to do this in a consensus, as we mentioned before. Election is not about changing the game. It's about the rules of the game, but not changing the game altogether. And to do that, we need a consensus.
Danny, it's so interesting, and how all these issues, even the ones that are separate, do have connections to each other. And I just want to go back to the UN and to Biden and Netanyahu for a moment. You said that, it's water under the bridge, that it took so long. Now we're moving forward, working towards this possible normalization with Saudi Arabia, which, as you mentioned, could be history absolutely in the making. And maybe we'll just shift something in what we're seeing now, even with the judicial reform, even with all the conflict. Perhaps this will be the thing that gives a bit of a shift to the current situation.
Yes, and as I told you, Teisha, I'm an optimist. I believe that out of this crisis, we will go much stronger. Maybe with the new understanding, with the new domestic and the civil understanding between the ultra-Orthodox and the secular, between all segments of Israeli society. And this can be reached. What unites us is so much more important and so much larger than what separates us, because our enemies, they do not distinguish between a Sephardi Jew, an Ashkenazi Jew, a leftist Jew, right-wing Jew, and this is why we should understand, and for that we need, of course, leadership on all sides. Leadership on all sides. I told you that there is this extra mile, the extra, let's say, weight on the government, because they have the power, they have the budgets, they have in control, they have the. But I also hope that in the opposition, there also will be some reckoning, and we should not just cross a point of no return. And this is where we are today. We've had Yom Kippur, which was the best day for reflection. I'm not sure that this day was used properly by all sides. but there's always a second chance. And as I told you, we will go through it, and not only will survive it, but we will thrive.
I add my hope to your optimism as well, Danny, and it's always such a pleasure to have you on JBS. We have you as whenever we can get you, we will take you because your experience and knowledge is so valuable. And wishing you a Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you. Shana Tova to all of the people of Israel, and Am Israel Chai.
Danny Ayalon is the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. We thank him so much for his time today. And thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, to our transmissions manager, John McDevitt, technical manager, Michael Paley, producer, Carol Lilienthal, and thank you for watching In the News.